Hello and welcome back to part 3 of my indie game devlog. Last video we reviewed our reference games and determined our control layout, implementing the most basic of player controls, getting some shooting mechanics and weapons in, as well as the ability to equip said weapons and throw them. And we also discussed the setting and aesthetic lens we'll be using when designing mechanics going forward. So first and foremost, if you've clicked on this video, you've probably noticed from the title that going forward, I'll be referring to this game as Project Concordia, after the setting it'll be based in that I detailed in the last devlog. This is a working title and isn't indicative of the final name of the game, but hopefully it gives a better impression of what I'm making than just indie game. With that out of the way, I think the next step forward to prototyping this game is to set up some programmer art that goes a little further than just 2 blocks. This is by all means a temporary measure, mainly meant to be placeholder while the systems for art are put in place, but knowing my track record, these placeholder assets will probably stick around for a considerable amount of time. Anyway, these are not at all an indication of what the final product will look like, so in this situation, replicating some basic sprites in the style of our reference should be fine. After doing a bit of research and pulling up a couple sprite sheets, I very quickly mocked up this test sprite sheet that has a super simple loop for a leg animation, several body sprites including some holding guns, and both a knockdown sprite and a dead sprite, ingeniously identifiable by the cross on the dead sprite's chest. By making these sprites so generic, I can easily utilize them for both the player and enemies during prototyping, and easily color them as necessary. Luckily, replacing the existing prototype art with these test sprites was fairly trivial, and by checking when the player was in motion, I could just set the leg animation to start playing automatically. Setup for the enemy was similar, and testable using a debug input to give the enemy a target destination. And by using a pathfinding asset that we imported in the last devlog, I simply set the leg animation to run whenever the enemy was still traveling towards its target. Super simple stuff. Now, in my past game dev experience, I've put on a couple of hats, mainly in design and art, but obviously in programming as well in my last game, Dial In. However, setting up AI is an incredibly daunting concept. There are a lot of things to consider, tons of edge cases, and aside from an AI algorithm class in uni that only culminated in programming my own A-star setup, which I've already downloaded an asset for, I've got pretty much zero experience. So I'm going to step you through my main thought process and the resulting enemy AI we end up with. As always, I did a bit of research into how enemies usually act and react in top-down games similar to what I'm making. But I already had a general expectation on what they tend to do. Based on this, I set up an enumerator of enemy states that I can use to identify what an enemy's objective is at any given time. These states are idling, where an AI stands stationary, patrolling, where an AI adheres to a preset path, wandering, where the AI will randomly check points around themselves, searching, where the enemy travels to a specific point, generally when alerted to a gunshot or loud noise, hunting, when the enemy has located the player and is actively pursuing them, attacking when the enemy is in range and attempting to attack with their specified weapon, downed, which is essentially a null state while they're knocked down and attempting to stand up again, and dead, where they're turned off with no functionality at all. Now, that's a lot of information to dump all at once, so don't worry about keeping track of all of those. We'll be returning to each one as they're implemented. But that's a very loose overview of the capabilities of the enemies. So, being the master programmer that I am, I started with the 2 easiest states, idle and patrolling. The idle state will pretty simply set the enemy to return to their initial position, and then do nothing once they arrive. So, assuming they start in the idle state, they will just stand still. Super straightforward. Patrolling is just as easy. By setting a series of coordinates in a list, the enemy can simply move towards each point, iterating through them as it arrives at each destination. For the sake of flexibility, I went ahead and added an alternate setting for cyclical patrols, where the patrol will loop, versus standard patrols where the enemy will travel in reverse once it finishes the patrol. This isn't anything I haven't done before. We're essentially looking at the AI variation of the moving platform code that I used in my last game. Unfortunately, as far as easy implementation goes, we've hit a wall. So I'm immediately going to procrastinate by setting up more player functionality instead. referring back to Hotline Miami and his signature: when striking an enemy with any hit, they are knocked down onto the floor. In Hotline Miami's case, if this hit is non-lethal, the enemy will eventually recover. So for our case, currently the only non-lethal damage an enemy can take is from a thrown weapon. By hooking into our existing implementation, we can simply identify when a thrown weapon collides with an enemy, and tell that enemy to get knocked down in a certain direction. I got a little sneaky here and ended up reusing a lot of the same code as the thrown weapons for the enemy, specifically the decay function, but aside from a couple issues actually telling the enemy which direction to fall in, I feel like it worked out pretty well. Once a knocked down enemy is hit, it enters the down state I mentioned earlier to block any other logic running, and a timer begins counting up to a specified knockdown time length. In this case, around 4 seconds. Since the AI currently can't attack the player, from here they return to their initial state, either idling or patrolling, and will fall back onto the path they were already travelling. This really wasn't enough of a deviation for me. I needed to procrastinate more, so instead of moving on to the other enemy states, I instead decided to implement melee weapons, which are notably missing from last week's devlog. So, similar to how we created guns in the last devlog, I've opted to make melee weapons run through a standard melee controller that I can give to both players and enemies, specifying how a melee weapon works with a scriptable object. However, unlike a gun, there aren't really that many ways you can implement a melee weapon. Ultimately, I separated melee weapons into 2 types: line weapons that cast out a ray directly in front of them, and spot weapons that cast a circle at a specified size and hit all valid targets within it. Luckily, I made the knockdown system fairly straightforward to execute at any given time, so it was only common sense that I'd get melee weapons actually working. I also quickly added a lethal check input to the knockdown function that tells the enemy that they're dead. For now, that just translates to deactivating the enemy as an object once their body stops moving, but it already makes guns feel like a separate option to melee weapons. And with that brief detour, I've run out of things to procrastinate with. Alright, I guess there's no way around it. So, my first step was setting up a system for field of view. I need enemies to see things in front of them, and not behind them. It'd feel terrible if you were running up to an enemy trying to get the jump on them, and they just turned around instantly and gunned you down. So, similar to the pathfinding asset I imported last devlog, I wasn't exactly in the mood to reinvent the wheel, and I ended up following a tutorial that I'll link below for anyone who's interested. This is the most important step to setting up enemy AI. If they can't react to the player's presence, then they're hardly an obstacle. Currently, this field of view component just sets a flag saying that it's seen the player, so let's do something with that. When the AI sees a player, it immediately swaps to its hunting state. In this state, it sets the player to be its pathfinding target and immediately begins moving towards them, attempting to get within range to attack. Their range is found in this extra field I added to the preset weapon objects, cleverly called AI range. Once their distance from the player is closer than that range, they swap to their attacking state and attack. By either running the gun component or melee component attached to them, they will attack the player in the same way the player attacks them. I went ahead and let Unity compile these additions, and here's how they turned out. Alright, so clearly that needs a little work. The bullets are obviously firing in the wrong direction, but that's easily fixed with some rotation shenanigans. The main things to note here are that the enemy doesn't track the player and will just shoot in the direction that they first saw them, and the more obvious glaring issue is that there's no delay between shots. The latter of those two is far easier to fix by simply adding an AI delay field alongside the AI range to our gun object. We can then set a timer between shots so that the AI fires more reasonably. That handles the second issue fairly easily. However, the prior is still a little bit more involved. For the sake of time, I'm going to sum it up as just rotating the enemy to face the player at all times while it's in its attacking state. But in reality, it was a bit more difficult to implement since it was effectively overriding the rotation implemented by the pathfinding system, and having a bit of a conflict with that. Now, you might be wondering why I felt the need to mention these issues, especially since they were resolved so quickly. I really want part of these devlogs to explore the challenges associated with developing a project solo, and touching on some of the bugs and errors that come up during development feels like an appropriate way of doing so. Anyway, with this code in place, it wasn't a huge leap from here to set up melee for enemies as well. By specifying an AI range and AI delay for each melee weapon, I got enemies to run straight up to the player before swapping to their attacking state, and since there are currently no implementations for player damage, they send a log to the console every time the player is hit. Having this current setup for enemies is technically all we need to capture the most basic feeling of this game, but I know for a fact it needs more. To keep these devlogs a bit more manageable, I'll be splitting our AI implementation into a second devlog, getting behavior for searching and wandering states sorted on top of what we've already done. Thank you to everyone who watched this devlog. I'll be honest, I ended up getting a bit sick recently and totally losing my voice for a week, but I tried to find time to get this devlog out so there is some semblance of a semi-consistent schedule. Next devlog, we'll aim to finish off the enemy script, and maybe we'll see about getting some more prototype art in. If that sounds like something that interests you, be sure to subscribe and hit the notifications button so you're notified whenever another devlog comes out. And if you enjoyed this devlog, I'd appreciate it if you could leave a like and a comment on what you'd like to see going forward.